Welcome to The Real Heal. I am your host, Dr. Renee Wallenstein, also known as the Libidoologist. So if you're ready, let's get into it. Stephanie, I'm so excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Renee. It is just wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Well, when we were connected and I heard your story and I heard you talking about a condition that your son has that I had never heard of, and the fact that you are just really trying to raise awareness around this condition, I absolutely 100% thought like you need to be on this podcast because, we're all about raising awareness and especially since I talk to my audiences, mostly women, but with children of varying ages. So I think really putting this on everybody's radar is helpful, beneficial, especially as a parent not knowing a lot in the medical system, like how to navigate what could be going on. Like just putting this on the radar as far as a differential if your child is having some difficulties, what it could be. So before we get into that though, why don't you tell us who you are and how you got doing what you're doing today?
Well, thank you. My name is Stephanie Duesing, and I am an author, speaker, and international advocate for people who have cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI. I'm actually a former music teacher. I taught middle school for 10 years. I taught music, general music, and also chorus, which I loved. And then when my son was born, I took some time off. During that time period, I was invited to teach the kindergarten choir at my church. And that was a joy. It later became the K through 2 choir. And during that time, I really became interested in early childhood music and movement. And so later I became an early childhood music and movement specialist, a music garden teacher, which is a beautiful Montessori-based program. And so then I taught music garden out of my home. I ran classes for family music for babies, toddlers, and also for preschoolers. So I have a wide range of experience of teaching people of all ages to sing. I'm actually a bel canto trained dramatic soprano. I have a vocal condition and I no longer sing for that reason, but I am qualified to teach voice at the collegiate level.
Wow.
So I have been teaching voice lessons, teaching babies, toddlers, middle schoolers, high schoolers, everybody in between, so music has always just been my passion and my joy. And in January of 2017, we discovered that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son, Sebastian, was almost completely blind, and nobody knew, not even Sebastian himself. And I can't even tell you, I still get goosebumps when I say that. It was so devastating. And we were just terrified for his safety. Overnight, we went from being what we thought were just the very blessed parents of an extremely gifted child to not knowing if my son could ever live independently. Overnight, it just felt like our lives just blew up. And it was extremely challenging. Cerebral/cortical visual impairment, which I'm going to call CVI from now on, is actually the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world. Last year, for the first time, the National Institute of Health, or the NIH, recognized CVI as the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world for the very first time. And so that's a huge improvement in things since when we discovered Sebastian had it in 2017. But there's actual research coming out now showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI. And so that makes CVI more prevalent than autism. So this is a huge public health crisis, and that's why I do what I do. We were labeled crazy by the medical establishment for trying to get a diagnosis for a common visual impairment for my son. And we were repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. I was actually physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist I'd never even met. The man came into our exam room without introducing himself, put his fist in my face and screamed at me in front of my son. So we had a very challenging time and $150,000 in medical bills. And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from the very first appointment after we discovered that my son had CVI. And it was just a disaster. And so I'm here today to talk about CVI because now I know that what happened to us is actually not uncommon. This happens every day all across the world. because there's no diagnostic code for CVI. And I understand medical professionals, we have many really fabulous doctors in our life. I mean, we've been really blessed to have wonderful doctors. And so this is not against all doctors or anything, but it is a fact that because there is no diagnostic code for CVI right now, the vast majority of doctors receive no training in it whatsoever. And so this is an enormous problem. And because families can't get a diagnosis for the CVI, the children can't get access to educational and habilitative services, and it's a tragedy. So I'm really grateful to be here today to talk about this, and I just want to thank you so much again.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. So, the purpose of having you on obviously is to raise awareness and to discuss this condition, just so we put it out there. So, education changes lives, being informed, being an educated consumer. I hate to say that in healthcare, but it's true. You have to be, unfortunately those days, and I say this often, of having just trusting you're going to go to your doctor and just get the right diagnosis, the right treatment is no longer the case anymore. A lot of times you have to be an advocate for your own health. And again, I don't say this. I was in the conventional world for over 15 years. Like, I don't say this to bash doctors by any means. They are very busy. And like you said, we are very limited in our training. If it doesn't have a code, we don't learn about it. So, so we're not bashing doctors. We're not bashing the overall healthcare system. We're just sort of, stating the facts.
The problem. Recognizing the problem. Yeah.
Yep. And, and healthcare nowadays of what you have to do to get an answer. So CVI, we were saying before, you said cortical / cerebral, like they can't agree on what to call it. So we're just going to call it CVI. Mm-hmm. What are the symptoms? And like, is there an age of presentation typically? And I know a lot of this is new, but of the research that's been done or is being done, what are like the ages? Is it more prevalent in a certain sex? What are the symptoms?
So I'll tell you a little bit about what CVI is.
Okay.
CVI is a brain-based vision impairment that's entirely different from ocular blindness. Mm-hmm. Ocular blindness is what most people think of when they think about blindness, and they imagine that everything is dark when you're blind. That's a stereotype. In fact, the vast majority of people who are ocularly blind have some level of vision. They might just have light perception. They might be able to see a certain part of their visual field, but the vast majority of ocularly blind people actually do have some level of vision, and very few of them are actually the stereotype of everything being dark. So I just wanted to dispel that myth right away. So ocular blindness is where there's damage to the eye and to the optic nerve, one or the other or both, right? CVI is caused by brain damage. I attended a wonderful lecture last summer with Dr. Arvind Chandna and Dr. Gordon Dutton, two wonderful experts in CVI. And it was an online lecture. And in this lecture, Dr. Chandna was talking about how they've actually measured the amount of time it takes before when the light hits the retina of the eye, and it's converted into an electrical signal, and it travels to the optic nerve past the LGN, or the lateral geniculate nuclei, to the back of the brain. Mm-hmm. And they've measured the amount of time it takes between when the light initially hits the eye and there's any conscious perception of sight. Excuse me. Sorry for my voice. So I don't know how they've measured it. I'm imagining with fMRI scanning or something, but it takes actually 1/10 of a second after the light strikes the retina for that signal to travel to the back of the brain before there's any conscious perception of sight at all. In other words, all of our seeing happens in our brain. The idea that we see with our brains is not a slogan, it's an actual fact. And in fact, we see absolutely nothing with our eyes by themselves. Our eyes are just light collectors. Mm-hmm. They collect light and they transmit it into an electrical signal. That's all they do. We don't start to see until that signal reaches the back of the brain, and that's when vision begins. And in fact, there are people alive on the planet right now who don't have any eyes, who can see. And I'm going to give an example. His name is Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish lost both eyes to cancer in infancy and taught himself how to echolocate. And in fact, Daniel teaches blind people how to echolocate. And I have a very dear friend in Iceland who has CVI, who got to work with him last fall. And he's quite an amazing person. Daniel has no eyes, but he can ride a bike. Daniel has no eyes, but he can describe complex visual scenes, which means you can take him somewhere he's never been and he can tell you what he sees around him.
Wow.
Daniel has no eyes, but he can read if the letters are three-dimensional. So when they put Daniel in the fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, they have shown that Daniel's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. And so that means that he's literally seeing with echoes, just like a bat or a dolphin or a whale. And this is actually a teachable skill that you can teach to other people. And so that's what he does for a living. So I want to talk about that because I want to be very clear that our eyes are not how we see. It's our brains that do the seeing. And in fact, more than 40% of our brain is involved in visual processing. So in CVI, what happens is when the signal reaches the back of the brain, we've got two different visual pathways. There's the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. And these are not two separate processing streams. They're actually interactive and they talk back and forth to each other. So having problems with one will obviously then necessarily create havoc with the other one because they're not separate systems. They're not independent of each other. So the dorsal stream is the stream that comes up the back of the head. I always think of the dorsal fin of a shark. And so in that system, that's the part of the visual processing that helps us to deal with cluttered scenes, where things are, trying to sort out stuff in a crowd. So people who have damage to the dorsal stream of their visual processing may have difficulty finding a face in a crowd. They might have difficulty finding their shoes in a pile by the door. They might have difficulty, a child might have difficulty finding a specific toy in a toy box full of toys. And I always like to use the example of Where's Waldo, the children's book, Where's Waldo, where you have to find the little guy in the crowded scene. People who have dorsal stream dysfunction can find that actually physically painful to look at because it is just so overwhelming to them. They literally, it can make them feel nauseous to try to look at that. Going into a grocery store is commonly very overwhelming for people with dorsal stream dysfunction. If you can imagine the shelves just filled with all the stuff, it's just overwhelming. So that's the dorsal stream. The ventral stream has to do with visual memory. So in the ventral stream, that part runs more through the bottom middle part of the brain. And that's where visual memories of different things are stored. And different visual memories of different categories of things are stored in different places along that ventral stream. And so, for example, if you take your right hand and touch above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is. And that's where facial recognition takes place. So people who have difficulty with facial recognition, often they have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain, and they can have a condition called prosopagnosia or face blindness. People who have face blindness very often also have a companion disorder called topographical agnosia, or the inability to recognize their surroundings, their environments, because the place that in the brain that recognizes environments is right close up to where the same place where you recognize faces. So if one of those areas is damaged, it's really frequent that the other area is damaged as well. So those two things tend to go together. There's a different area in the brain for recognizing objects. There's a different area in the brain for recognizing words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. There's a different area in the brain for recognizing biological forms. For example, bodies, hands, face. There's actually a finger agnosia where if you damage a certain area of your brain, you can lose the ability to recognize your fingers and anybody else's. So as you can imagine, when you talk about the symptoms of CVI, Dr. Gordon Dutton, who is one of my great heroes and one of the greatest experts in CVI, he has a saying that he said, if you've met one person who has CVI, you have met one person who has CVI. Because when the brain damage occurs, it's fairly random. And while there are commonalities and certain symptoms that tend to be common among people who have CVI, like dorsal stream dysfunction is a common one, right? The actual individual symptoms can vary so widely. And because CVI is caused by brain damage, there's a constellation of other symptoms, other conditions that can go along with them, comorbidities, if you will. And
Mhm.
so the reason that we have so many people who have CVI now is because our NICU care has increased exponentially in the last couple of decades. And now we have all of these teeny tiny preemies who did not used to survive, who now thankfully do survive, but they very often have brain bleeds. And so they very often have cerebral palsy, they have epilepsy, and they very often also have CVI.
Mm.
And so the resulting, the outcome for people with CVI can vary really widely based on what other issues they're also facing, if that makes sense. So
Mhm.
it just depends. So you
Wow.
can see, I'm here today to talk about how the fact that CVI can actually be an entirely invisible disability. My son, Sebastian, as I said at the beginning, was a straight A honor student. He's a genius artist who can draw and paint with almost photographic realism when he wants to. And physically very athletic. He was on the diving and the water polo teams at his high school. We had no idea that my blind son had any disabilities of any kind until we accidentally discovered it at the age of 15, right before we enrolled my blind son in driver's ed.
Mm.
And so I'm here to dispel some myths, because one of the big myths about CVI is that supposedly all people who have CVI are severely developmentally delayed. That's a huge myth. And in fact, we know now, as I said, that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI. We have research showing that, which tells us that indeed that is a myth. We have all kinds of people walking amongst us who may be severely visually impaired, like my son is. My son actually has almost no vision at all. And there's no way to tell academically, socially, or physically. It's an invisible disability. And so I'm here to call for universal screening for all preschoolers for CVI.
How would they do that?
That's a great question. So
Yeah.
the Perkins School for the Blind has recently created something called the CVI protocol, which is
Okay.
one measure of CVI. And it's in development right now. It's not, I don't think it's been officially released, but they are starting to use it. It is all research based, and it will be available online to
Okay.
people, for people to use. And so this is something that's important. There's
Yeah.
also an app that's been developed by Dr. Nicola McDowell, who is in New Zealand. Dr. McDowell has CVI and has her PhD in, I think she's in the education side, I'm not positive. But there's an app that she's developed that can screen, I think it's screening for dorsal stream dysfunction. I don't know that much about it because I haven't actually used it myself and I haven't seen it. So, but people are working on ways of screening for this. And I wanted to talk because many of the symptoms, many of the common symptoms of CVI are really easy to screen for. I mentioned my dear friend in Iceland who has CVI. This friend of mine is an opera singer, and she didn't get diagnosed until she was 26 years old. She's legally blind in Iceland and didn't know she was blind until she was 26 years old. And she has many symptoms of CVI as well as ocular forms of blindness. So she's blind. And one of her symptoms that is actually a common symptom, but one that my son doesn't have, is lower visual field loss. And so for my friend, she can't see anything beneath her nose and never has. She's never seen her shoes while she's walking. She's never seen her feet while she's walking. She's never seen the stairs as she's going down them, right?
Wow.
And I mean, she has many other damage to her visual processing as well. So this is just one symptom. And this was, as a child, was put in a regular ed gym class playing soccer. Imagine.
But did she not know? Like, so I guess I'm just like, my brain is trying to wrap I can't, it's just so hard to understand, like,
Yeah.
because, what I've been trained in, like the vision, eyes, like in the brain, and, like, and I know there's a connection, but like the fact that she couldn't see below her nose, like, did that just come about, or is that something that
She
she
was
had
born that
had?
way. She was born that way. So birth trauma. So I just want to be really clear because that is such an excellent question. And I am so glad you asked it, because all people who are born with CVI assume that their vision is typical and that you see what they see.
Mm.
because they have absolutely no way of knowing that their vision is different. So
Wow.
they
Yeah.
cannot tell you that they can't see because they don't know they can't see because they've never seen with the typical brain. They don't know. They literally
Wow.
don't know. And everybody around them assumes that they see what you see, and so it's kind of this vicious cycle, and it has to be
Wow.
tested for. So my son literally didn't know that he couldn't see what we see. And many people who have CVI develop really brilliant compensation strategies to fit into a world that expects you to be sighted. And my son did that as well. I haven't
Mhm.
talked much about my son's actual condition. If that's okay, I'll take a minute to talk.
Yeah. 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 I was going to actually pick your brain about that a little bit. So go for it.
Yeah, because I know there's people wondering, how could he be blind and no one knows? And how could you not tell, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So first of all, I want to talk about, I've told you a little bit about what CVI is, and now I want to talk about what my son can't see, and then I'll tell you about what he can see. It's just
Okay.
easier to explain it that way. So my son has damage to the right fusiform gyrus of his brain. So he has prosopagnosia, which means he can't recognize his face or anybody else's. And that was quite a shock for us to discover, because here's my kid who's been drawing beautiful, realistic faces for years, right? So this was a shock to discover.
Mm.
But he also has topographic agnosia. As we talked about, those two things often go together because they're processed so closely together in the brain. So my son has no ability to recognize his environments either, which means when you have topographic agnosia, it means that it doesn't matter how many times you walk into your own home, how many times you walk into your own bedroom, nothing ever looks familiar. Nothing forms a visual memory of your surroundings. It just doesn't stick. It's like putting up your video camera and not pressing record and then going back to look at what you had on your video recorder, right? And there's nothing there because you didn't press record. Nothing's recording. And so there's people who have topographic agnosia, they can't form mental maps of their world because they have absolutely no visual landmarks at all, ever. So it's a blindness of your environment. So my son has a face blindness, a blindness of his environment, but he also has object agnosia. And so he cannot recognize objects at all. And he also can't recognize biological forms. So for example, my son can't recognize his own hands, face, or body. It's not just prosopagnosia. It's really severe. And it's the same for animals and other people. No biological forms are recognized at all. And he also has the dorsal stream dysfunction. So he has all those issues as well with visual clutter and crowded scenes and all of that. So the only things that my blind son can see the way a typically sighted person can see are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes, because the parts of his brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes were not damaged. And so he's able to form a visual memory of those things, and he can recognize them just like we do. In typically sighted individuals with typical neurotypical brains, visual recognition is effortless. It takes no effort on our part whatsoever. When I say Mona Lisa, everyone who's ever seen an image of the Mona Lisa knows exactly what I'm talking about. And you can form an image of that in your brain with the long dark hair and the mysterious smile and the hooded eyes, right? It's right there and you can see it. You can actually see it in your brain. That's visual recognition. When an outside image comes through the eyes, a new image, and it is able to match up with a pre-existing image that's already stored in the brain. That's visual recognition. Totally effortless. Typically, neurotypical people do this without effort all day long, constantly, all day. People who can't form visual memories, whether it's of faces or places or biological forms or words, letters, numbers, simple shapes, that ability is gone. It's just not there. And for every single person that I've ever met with CVI, and I know quite a few now because of what I do, that doesn't come back. Right? It's just gone. It's an absence. And people find workarounds on how to deal with that. And so for my son, the reason that we did not know that my son was blind until he was 15, first of all, was because there's no training, right? And none of his doctors caught it. And so I don't know how we were supposed to catch it. But also because my son is actually the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally. which means that he sees with words just like a bat sees with sound. As we talked about earlier with Daniel Kish seeing with echoes, like Daniel Kish, my son has unique visual processing. And so my son, from a very early age, learned that he could identify things and people by the way we describe them, because he couldn't do it by the way he could not recognize them. And so for my son, for years, I always wore glasses and then I had cataract surgery a couple of years ago and I'm not wearing them now. But my characteristics were tall blonde glasses. And when my son thinks those words to himself, he quite literally gets a momentary flash of what I look like. He gets a momentary image. It's just a flash. He says he gets an idea of it and then it disappears and it's gone. There's no retention in visual memory. It's just completely gone. But Sebastian actually spent 6 hours in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. Dr. Lotfi Marabat, who is the director of the laboratory and also associate scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear, and also associate professor of ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School, actually captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI and published a paper on it in Neurobiologia with Dr. Barry Cran, who is the director of the optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. And so, according to Dr. Marabat, my son is actually the most studied individual in the world with CVI. They actually changed the entire scope and direction of the research at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity based on what they learned from my son. And they are now tracking the verbal IQ scores of everyone who comes through that research study because of what they learned from Sebastian. So this is actually a true story. This actually happened to us. And what my son did is he quite literally taught himself to see with words. And I don't know if you know what an fMRI, all the listeners know, but an fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's different from a regular MRI. In a regular MRI, it's a machine that takes pictures of what your brain looks like. It measures the structure of your brain, but it tells you absolutely nothing about how well your brain is actually working. An fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and that actually shows you what the brain is doing. And so, as we talked about with Daniel Kish, who lost both eyes to cancer in infancy and taught himself to echolocate, Daniel's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes. And when my son is in the fMRI, my son's visual cortex lights up when he thinks word descriptors to himself. So he quite literally sees with words. And what that allows him to do is it allows him to pass for typically sighted. And my son quite literally taught himself to do this at a very young age, just like Daniel Kish. And my son taught himself to do this through art. He memorized the verbal characteristics of everything and everyone around him by drawing, painting, and sculpting them. And he got so good at it that now he can draw and paint with photographic realism when he wants to. And he's almost completely blind. And I just wanted to go back really quick and say, and yes, my son is blind because my son is actually the only person in the world known to be able to choose to see and not see with his eyes wide open. My son can actually turn his vision off when he is not thinking verbal descriptors to himself to get an idea of what things look like. His vision is actually off completely, and he has no conscious perception of sight. And they captured that in the fMRI as well. And so what that means is, and I'd like to talk about this as well today, there's a companion disorder to CVI, which also commonly goes along with CVI, called Central Auditory Processing Disorder, or CAPD. Just like CVI is where the eyes technically work and the optic nerve is working, but the vision still isn't happening because there's damage to the brain. CAPD, or auditory processing disorder, is where the ear is technically here, but the brain can't translate those sounds into recognizable speech or language, or it may have difficulty doing that. So for my son, he actually has both CVI and CAPD, because if you can imagine, if you're attending, say, a physics lecture and you want to listen to the lecture and also see the slides that the that the teacher is putting up on the board, right? For my son, in order to see those slides, he has to have this internal narration going on, describing what he's seeing. And so if you imagine that you had to silently recite the Declaration of Independence to yourself while you listen to a physics lecture on string theory, you might have a hard time getting a lot of information out of the lecture, right?
Yeah.
And so my son actually does have CAPD, diagnosed CAPD, and it's common. Many, if not most people who have CVI also have this. And I'm here today to say that I think that one of the biggest tragedies of our time is the failure of our medical establishment to recognize deafblindness as a spectrum disorder. Because I consider my son to be on the deaf-blind spectrum because he's almost completely blind, and he quite literally cannot hear well and see well to the best of his ability at the same time. He can either pay attention to what he's trying to see as well as he can see, or he can listen. And in fact, my son spends most of his waking hours, we know now, with his vision off so that he can listen to the conversations around him. He uses his vision for visual tasks like cooking, doing an art project, academic things, right? Cleaning the bathroom, something like that. But when he's just hanging out with the group of people, he's just listening, his vision is off and he can't see. And I'll be totally honest with you, having lived with him for his entire formative years, you can't tell that his vision is off. There's no way. And in fact, here's another huge myth about CVI that I'm about to break. One of the biggest myths about CVI is that all people who have CVI don't make eye contact. Well, we have photo after photo after photo of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. Photo after photo. And we have we have several photos of my son using visual guidance of reach at a developmentally appropriate age. And so I wanted to get back to how my son developed CVI. We know that CVI can happen to anyone at any age because it's caused by brain damage. It can cause by stroke, by drowning incidents, if you survive a drowning incident, anything that's anoxic, right? And also by having head trauma. All these things can cause CVI. So that's why it's so common, because head trauma and stroke and brain injury is common. So it's not a mystery. And we've actually known about CVI since World War I. So none of this is new information. Scientists have been studying CVI for 100 years. So this is not new information at all. We had all those soldiers who survived gunshots, wounds to the head in World War I and came home, and their eyes and their optic nerves were fine, but they could not see. And so we've known about this for 100 years. And I'd also like to address one other thing, because I know people are wondering, well, how could he be blind and be moving through space? Well, my son has a symptom of CVI called blind sight, which we've known about for 100 years and have studied for 100 years. Blind sight is a function of motion perception. And so there's a wonderful article on NPR called The Blind Woman Who Saw Rain. And it's about a real woman who lost all light perception from stroke as an adult. And her doctor said, well, you're just blind now. You're never going to see anything again. And some weeks went by, and then she realized she could see the motion of the rain on the windshield of the car. She could see the motion of her daughter's ponytail as her daughter skipped ahead of her. She could not see the ponytail. She could just see the swishing motion of her daughter's, the hair as it moved. And so this is blind sight. And blind sight is something we've known about for a long time. And it allows people who are blind, it's, like I said, a function of motion perception, to travel through space without bumping into things. And so my son has blind sight, and you could take him to a warehouse filled with obstacles everywhere, and my son would never bump into anything. We've never had an issue with him bumping into things. And in addition to that, we also know he has something called affective blind sight. And so my son has always been extremely aware of and responsive to facial expressions. My son can see and recognize facial expressions, even though he can't recognize the faces themselves. And he's always been very attuned to that. And I think that that would give an infant a huge motivation to look at faces, even when they can't recognize the faces themselves. And so I think as doctors and parents and educators, you have to be aware that just because a child appears to be looking and they're looking in the direction that you would want them to, looking does not equal seeing. Looking is a behavior, right? But it doesn't tell you what the person actually sees. And this is a huge myth in the CVI community, where parents are told often that if you just train them to look longer and harder, that means their vision's becoming typical. Well, my son's always been looking longer and harder, and his vision is not typical. So we just have to really be aware. I mean, as a person, before I had cataract surgery, I had very severe ocular vision issues. I mean, my ultra thin lenses were Coke bottles, right? And it just drives me crazy because every time I sat down in that optometric chair and looked at the giant E and saw nothing. And I know many people, many families of kids with CVI, and they're always told, well, if they're looking, then they're fine. That means their vision's fine. And I'm like, well, I spent a lot of time looking at that big E, seeing nothing. So looking doesn't mean anything, not for ocular vision impairments and not for CVI. Looking's just a behavior. It doesn't tell you what you can see.
I have a question about your son. So, and I guess I'm just trying to piece it together in my mind.
Yeah.
So you said a lot of times it's stroke, it's brain injury, it's birth trauma. And I understand, like, if kids are born with it or experience at a young age in their developmental years, but two questions, can this occur, say, to a 16-year-old with a head injury in football?
Yeah.
If
and we're actually seeing issues with vision from COVID.
Okay.
Right.
So, yeah. Where do you, so your son got diagnosed at 15 and
we figured it out at 15. It took 15 months to get him diagnosed. 15 months. Yeah.
So what were his so I guess two questions. What caused his, do we know? And what were his symptoms? Because if he had compensated for the world around him to be in the seeing, hearing world, and he's functioning A student, honors, artistic, all the thing, athletic, like, what was that thing that made you say there's something going on here?
I'm so glad. Okay, so there's multiple questions in there. So I'll start. First of all, for my son was born with CVI, and he was born full term. He was not a preemie. 3 days before I was due, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia. I went straight to the hospital and I was induced. I coded from the epidural. My blood pressure crashed to 40/26. My husband, who was there the whole time, I mean, there was a fetal monitor in my son, and my husband said there was no fetal distress. So I did not have an emergency C-section, and I was unconscious for 6 hours of my labor. I woke up and was paralyzed from the chest down, and the nurse was pressing on my stomach saying, "Do you feel a contraction?" And I couldn't feel anything, So a couple hours later, I gave birth to him vaginally, and we were told that my son had a 9 on his APGAR score, which is really good. And we took him home from the hospital believing that we had a perfectly healthy baby. We know for certain that that's when my son got CVI, because there's, first of all, been nothing else ever. And also because my son has a partial photographic memory for text that he inherited from me. And mine disappeared after I gave birth to him, and I wasn't writing research papers, and I attributed my mild stroke symptoms to mom brain and feeling ditzy, because everyone in my mom play group was saying, "I'm so forgetful, I can't remember anything." And I just was like, I have mom brain, and it's really bad. And I just can't remember anything like I used to. But I have aphasia, I have difficulty recalling words, and like, it just was subtle, And like I said, I was a full-time mom. I wasn't writing research papers. It was several years before I realized that my photographic memory had disappeared. And I just didn't connect the events together until my son was 15. So we know that that's what it's from. So anyway, to get back to what you were saying, the only symptoms that we had that there might be something wrong with Sebastian, there were things. In fact, I will say my son was repeatedly misdiagnosed. He was repeatedly misdiagnosed. And the symptoms were vague. For my son, the only symptom was what appeared to be mostly mild anxiety that didn't make sense for how ordinary and calm and peaceful our lives were.
Gotcha.
And so starting when my son was about 2.5 years old, he started to express fears of going to regular places like the grocery store we went to every week. He'd called it, and these were his words, the I'm nervous game. He called it a game. And so I didn't really register how nervous he really felt because he was calling it a game. He wasn't having meltdowns. He wasn't having temper tantrums. But we'd get in the car to go to the grocery store and he'd say, I'm nervous, Mom. I'm nervous. And I'd be like, well, it's the same grocery store we went to last week. Why would you be nervous about going to the grocery store? I don't know. I'm nervous. And remember, kids who have CVI who are born with it can't tell you they can't see.
Yeah.
Right. They
So
can't
doesn't
tell
know
you.
what he's nervous about. Yeah.
Right. He didn't know what he was nervous about. And one of the common symptoms of CVI that I didn't mention is something called looming. And Dr. Gordon Dutton has talked about this quite a bit. And it's where people who have CVI often, like, things will not be in someone's visual awareness because their vision can't process it until suddenly it is right there, and that's looming. And so things jump out unexpectedly at people who have CVI. They don't see stuff coming, and then all of a sudden it's right in their face. And so this causes a lot of stress for people. And so my son was telling me, I'm nervous. And when I addressed it with his doctor, he said he was probably just seeking negative attention. Because here's my very gifted son who was already reading and writing at the age of 2.5, and who was making eye contact, was social, very verbal, all normal developmental milestones, very physical, very athletic, running around, riding a bike, took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4. There was nothing visually wrong with him that you could see. Yeah. And so they just said, well, he's probably seeking negative attention and just distract him. And so that's what I did. And it worked. And he stopped talking about it. And then when my son went to preschool, my son cried every day at drop-off for 2 solid years of preschool, despite being one of the older and very social kids. His very best friend in the world was in his class with him, and they loved each other, and he loved his teacher. He loved going, but at drop-off, he would cry, and it was a total mystery. It was very concerning. And there were other moms there with kids that were crying at drop-off, so it's like I wasn't the only one, but it was mystifying. And when I asked the teacher and his doctor again, I was told, some kids just do this. We worry about the ones who can't settle down. Well, my son always settled down and appeared to be fine. But what I know now, after many conversations with my son and knowing many adults and teens with CVI, it is terrifying to be blind and have nobody around you know that you're blind. It is terrifying. These people, my son included, all of my friends that have CVI that I know now and didn't get diagnosed until way late, all of them suffered pretty terrible trauma from this. I consider it akin to torture, putting a blind child in an environment.
They don't know they're blind, right? They don't know they're blind.
But they know that there's something wrong.
Okay.
They know.
I think I just want to clarify that because the audience, but they're blind. So, but they don't know they're blind. So how are they
know that
terrified?
They're blind, but they know that they're different. And I will tell you, all of them knew they were different, and all of them didn't know why. And they didn't know why it was harder. My son's exact words were, I always knew that I was more terrified about going places than everyone around me was, and I had no idea why.
Wow.
Yeah. And my son quite literally taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns as a toddler. So he was navigating our own home by counting his steps and turns. That's how bad his vision is.
It's interesting because, how gifted your son is. It sounds like his disability was actually an asset to him in his younger years because he was doing things that other kids didn't do because he had to get to navigate the world that everyone else could see.
Well, and I'm glad you talked about that because I've actually had this conversation many times with Sebastian and also with other friends of mine who have CVI, adults, and all of them were diagnosed very, very late, one at the age of 26. And it is such a double-edged sword right there, because he wasn't diagnosed and we didn't know. He wasn't babied, right? I know for a fact, if I had known how bad his vision was, I would have so overprotected him. Oh my gosh, I would have been so protective of him. And there are so many experiences my son would never have had because I wouldn't have let him do it, you know? And I told the story recently about, we used to go up to Colorado for vacations in the summer and whitewater raft. And there was a place we always stopped with a big, 50-foot boulder, cliff that you could jump off into the river where the water was deep enough. And my blind son was always the first to volunteer. That way to jump off the boulder into the water below. And I was afraid to do it. I'm like, no way am I going to do that. But I let him do it. And if I had known, oh my gosh, I'd been like, no, you can't do that. And there's no reason why a blind person can't jump off the boulder, right? It just would have been my own fear.
Yeah.
It's
So
fear.
there's pros and cons to the not knowing.
Yeah. And I just think that we need to strike a balance between not coddling kids, but also not torturing them by leaving them undiagnosed. There needs to be a happy medium.
Yeah. Because it sounds like to me is because you didn't know he had a little bit of unnecessary trauma at a younger age because of that anxiety of going to places and in preschool, that maybe you would have taken a little different approach. It sounds like it all turned out okay, but again,
I want to share another story. So Sebastian, he appeared to be just fine until it was time for him to change schools, going from elementary to middle school.
Mm-hmm.
And his fear was so powerful that he cried every single night the summer between 5th grade and the beginning of middle school at 6th grade. And he was telling us that he was afraid he was going to be lost at the new school. And we had no idea why.
Mm.
And I immediately sought help for him. I immediately sought therapy for him. And we were told that it was anticipational anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling us, I'm afraid I'm going to get lost. I'm afraid I'm going to get lost. And like, no one suggested, maybe he might have difficulty navigating. Maybe he should be evaluated for CVI. He was telling us what was wrong over and over, and no one picked up on it. And I just also want to say, my son had 2 IQ tests done for different reasons, full neuropsych eval when he was 15 years old for a totally unrelated concussion. And he had one done when he was in 3rd grade because he actually skipped a grade. The school came to us and told us that he finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade without assistance.
Wow.
We didn't even know he'd done it. I'm actually not a homework mom. I don't believe in homework before the age of 12, so there was no pressure here. My son has always scored in the 99th percentile in both math and English on all standardized tests without any preparation whatsoever. Okay. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because it's relevant, because when my son had to have his IQ tested for the grade promotion, he scored at the very top in the verbal, but there was more than a 20-point gap with the visual spatial, which should have been a clue to someone to say, oh, your son might have CVI. Maybe you should get him tested. And when I asked, well, what does this mean? Because my kid just finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade without help. And he's scoring in the 99th percentile in all his math tests, right? And the answer was, well, it means he's slower at math. And I'm like, no, you're not listening. He's faster at math. He just finished the 4th grade math book first quarter. I'm repeating myself. He's not slower at math. He's faster at math. So what does this mean? And the answer was, and I quote, he's just not as smart as you think he is. No one suggested he might have CVI. So my son was repeatedly misdiagnosed. Opportunities were missed. We had hard evidence of the fact that there was something wrong with his visual processing in the form of 2 separate neuropsych evals, IQ tests, whatever you want to call them, right? And even with that, we were just labeled crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is a real problem.
And I could see, from our conversation today that it's just so broad. It's like, it sounds like everyone's different, right? Every child, adult diagnosed with CVI potentially has a different deficit. Is that correct?
Yeah.
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 I
But
mean, there might be some common.
yeah, commonalities. Dorsal stream dysfunction is common, and it's really very simple to test for that. You just need Where's Waldo? I mean, like these aren't difficult to test for. Lower visual field loss is a very common symptom of CVI. That's so easy to screen for, right? How many fingers am I holding up? Now, how many fingers am I holding up, right? Just move them down. This is not brain surgery. It's not rocket science. These are really basic things that I don't think are that hard to screen for. They just need people to know how to screen for them and then actually do it.
Well, and to think about the diagnosis, right? Like if you don't even think about it, you're not going to test for it. So you have to think about it as a physician, as a treating healthcare provider, that this might be something going on, to do these simple tests, to even think about the 2-finger test.
Yeah.
So again, it comes back to the reason you're here today, which is awareness of like talking about it, and perhaps hopefully someone listening to this that may, inquire whether or not their child has this, that they're not met with such resistance as you were, because with the work you're doing, hopefully we're putting this more on the radar, and hopefully more healthcare providers are aware of this.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say that people who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism, intellectual disabilities, behavioral and emotional disorders. I mean, they tried to label my whole family as emotionally disordered, right?
Yeah.
Because my son had CVI.
Well, and I couldn't help but when you're telling us his story of like how many kids would be given anxiety medications because of his fear of going to stores, and going into the preschool or changing schools, like how many of those kids would be medicated because of an emotional disorder, right? Or mood disorder.
Yes. And I know for a fact that they are medicating children as young as 6 for anxiety, using powerful, they haven't done any research on how this affects a growing, developed brain, and how many of these kids are being medicated instead of being diagnosed as having a visual impairment or blindness.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to drive home here is, like in the beginning of our conversation, I was kind of under the impression that a lot of parents would be able to determine whether or not this should be a concern based on head trauma, stroke, birth trauma, like you said. But it sounds like with Sebastian, there was no occult birth trauma. Like it was trauma to you, but he came out in 9 APGAR score, like perfectly healthy baby, and now, has lived with CVI his whole life. So we can't really say that there's a red flag for any child. It's like, you just have to think about it if your child is having some of these symptoms that we discussed today.
So I have a dear friend who discovered that her daughter had CVI at the age of 12, I think it was a year and a half ago. And this happens all the time. And this child, again, there was issues with the birth, and again, had a 9 on the APGAR score, just like Sebastian. Passed for typically cited for 12 years, despite them raising concerns about different things, just like I raised concerned about different things, again, presenting mainly as anxiety, right? And again, this child actually has a worse vision than my son. This child has no ability to recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. At least the words and letters, I know for sure. Not sure about the simple shapes. I'd have to go back and look. But so this is a brilliant family. The mom is an educator. She's brilliant. The child is brilliant, extremely verbal, and able to describe her own functional vision, just like my son can now that she knows that she's blind. And they homeschool. And the mom has done every research-based dyslexia intervention known under the sun since this child was like 7 years old, doing everything they can, trying to help this child learn to read. And they discovered the child has CVI at the age of 12, and they started Braille about a year ago. And for the very first time, this child is reading at grade level because they cannot form a visual memory of letters and numbers, no matter how much time has been spent doing interventions, feeling the shapes, right? I mean, they can't form a visual memory of it. So the recognition is never automatic. It's just not there ever. Wow. And so the Braille now, they are taking off with math and taking off with reading. And it's just been extraordinary to watch.
Wow. That's powerful. Wow. This has been very educational. We could probably talk. I know you said at times you could talk 6 hours on this topic, and we could probably talk 6 hours because it's just fascinating, but my brain just has a hard time. Like, it's just so new to me. And it's just, I'm trying to hang on every word you're saying to try to visualize. And and fortunately I can do that. But wow, like, it's just really phenomenal that you're doing this work. And I'm sorry your son had to go through what he's gone through, but give us an update. How's he doing now?
Well, thank you. We're really grateful that he's doing really well now. Uh, um, the fact that we were labeled crazy by the medical establishment actually had serious impact on my son's long-term health, because while we were going through the CVI diagnosis, my son also had a very severe medical condition unrelated to that, and we were unable to access medical care for that condition for 2 solid years because we had supposedly over-medicalized my son. And so that has damaged his health. He has permanent issues that he has to deal with. But the good news is that he's doing really, really well despite that. We're really grateful. And I just want to say he's off at college now. He is excelling. He's been on the dean's list, straight A student every semester, I should say. It's not quarters. And he's working at his dream internship. So I mean, he's doing his thing, and he's happy, and he's safe, and yeah, so we're good. We managed. I want to give a shout out to Leader Dogs for the Blind, who gave my son a week-long orientation and mobility training camp, all expenses paid. They flew him out and helped him learn to use a white cane and to navigate while he's fully blind, using just the whole thing. They just have been really helpful. And my son is using his white cane on campus, and we're just really grateful that he has that.
That's so good. And I just want to mention, you did write a book, a memoir of your whole experience. So like, just in case the listeners want a little more, another resource to be able to sort of take a deeper dive into your story and what happened and what you went through. What's the name of your book, and where can they get a copy?
Oh, sure. It's available on Amazon. It's called Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. And the artwork on the cover is by Stephanie Duesing, who painted that self-portrait when he was 15 years old, blind.
Wow.
Oh, thank you.
Incredible story.
I have a lot of resources I'd like to send you to put in the show notes, if that's okay. For
Yep, absolutely.
About CVI for your listeners.
Yep. Just send them right along to the email. We'll make sure we get them. If they're not on the actual podcast, they'll be on my website. So there's always a link to that. So we can share as much as you want. And I always bookend my conversations with my experts with personal things. So for the listeners, what's something that you know now that you wish you knew 5, 10, 20 years ago?
Oh, it would have been nice to know that my son was blind. That would have been nice.
But at the end of the day, I mean, he's turned out pretty well. Sorry. And just know that you're doing everything in your power so this doesn't happen to other kids.
Thank you. Yeah, that's why I do this.
Well, thank you for joining me. I appreciate you giving up your time, so much information, all the resources. And where can my audience find you if they want to connect, reach out, maybe they have some extra questions? Where do you?
Oh, that's okay with you. Thank you. Yes, my name is Stephanie Duesing, Duesing. If you just Google my name, or you Google the book name, Eyeless Mind, it'll take you to my website, and there's a contact me there form. And I'm always happy to talk with people. If you have questions or just need assistance finding help, I can do that. So there's that, and I'm on Facebook too.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you and all the work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm out of here. Talk to you again soon.